Thank you. I'm not sure that I can live up to all the definitional expectations there, but it has been a great privilege and wonderful fun to be among this group and to be listening carefully to the conversations, knowing that I got to have some final words. One of my worst experiences in life, in fact, I was sure that it was purgatory, was when I was asked to serve on a jury in Fresno, California as second alternate, which meant I had to sit and listen to all of the deliberations, could not ask a single question during the proceedings, which no jury member could. And then they went off and decided things that I had nothing that I could say to it. They never needed me. So that was a week of purgatory as far as I was concerned. So thank you for letting me have a moment to speak to some of what we've been saying here. I did want to start with some of who I am. You heard kind of the Vita stuff, but I want you to know how my ears have been tuned to this particular conversation. I was trained University of Chicago, constructive theologian, theological hermeneutics. I'm also ordained within the Church of the Brethren and taught constructive theology within both our denominational seminary, of which we have one, as well as in the Mennonite Brethren seminary. These are radical pietist Anabaptist groups. The book Neither Protestant Nor Catholic was written by a Mennonite, which means we do look carefully at questions of community hermeneutics, of orthopraxis, not orthodoctrine, and we understand things through doing. So I must say, when I came into my own teaching career and then into this job at the Wabash Center, I brought with it an ecclesial sense that it was very important what we did. What we said in the classroom was important, but what we did with the space was just as, if not more, important. I'm now at the Wabash Center, and as executive director, what I do is facilitate reflective practices of teaching. So we have workshops, we have consultations, we have grants, we have resources, we have a journal, we give conferences. So I'm going to plug our programming right now because you really need to remember that we have money to help you do the work that you want to do around teaching and learning. We have grants, both small and large. We've increased both those amounts. Our small grants are now up to $5,000, and our large grants are up to $30,000. And we would love to work with projects that you conceive of that are around teaching and learning with faculty. We also have consultants. Leah mentioned one coming to her location. We have consultants that come to campuses. So that's my plug for the Wabash Center programming. My job as executive director is to think strategically about the trends and realities that are present within theological education and in teaching religion in the undergraduate world. So we work with both theological educators in seminaries and theological schools, as well as faculty who teach religion within colleges and universities. So I'm to be looking at those trends and realities and then propose programming that will help leverage and encourage conversations about teaching and learning that will have a sustained impact on the teaching and learning. I know that there are many metaphors about how you work with faculty, and the one that seems the most prevalent is that leading faculty is like herding cats. Well, yes, but you herd cats by moving the food dish. And what the Wabash Center is doing is introducing another and a valuable reward system into the faculty life so that you can be rewarded for the teaching and learning work that you're doing, not only for the scholarship and guild work. So see us as someone who really would like to invest in your future and in your work. So as that helps you at least have some sense of how my ears have been tuned for the work that, or for the conversations that I was observing among us. So to shift, as we all well know, theological education in North America was built out of models of clergy training that were largely dependent on denominational structures of formation, on societal structures of education, and on occupational structures tied to the local congregation. So we've had denominational structures of formation which helped form the beliefs and practices of the ministers we were preparing. We had societal structures of education which helped dictate what the content was, what knowledge was counted, and what constituted preparation, what was degree worthy. And we had occupational structures tied to the local congregation because most people, when our institutions were founded, could earn their living by serving in ministry that was tied in some way to a local congregation or parachurch organization. All of that was stable for a time. But as we all well know, that is part of what is no longer stable. None of those three are anymore. In fact, as we've heard in the last 3 days, we're all navigating new realities because of the instability of all three. We heard people seeking to expand the relevant knowledge that can be counted within theological education through science materials, seeking to locate formational practices in biblical Hebrew classroom, seeking to expand and recalibrate the preparation of ministry for an underserved constituency, seeking to understand the use of digital technologies within the classroom and within learning settings, seeking a personal transformative engagement with scriptural texts, seeking to understand the role of place and contexts of ministry within educational practices, and seeking to build conversational habits where we can address our dangerous conversations. All of these signal seismic shifts within the knowledge and content that we count within theological education, the context and place of learning, the ecclesial structures of ministry, and therefore the goals and aims and purposes of theological education. Who the student is, what the learning is for, and how to best go about it is all very much up in the air to be reconfigured. Now, despite Jaco's expert introduction, this won't be settled today in the next half hour. In fact, none of us can assume that it's going to be settled in the next decade or two. This is a very long-term shift that we're in the midst of. And as much as we can do as theological educators is find good conversation partners in order to begin to put down particular tent posts that will help us with the next step forward, knowing that we may be pulling up the ones that we just put down a couple years ago, but it'll at least help us move forward. So we can look for some signs, we can look for some pointers, we can look for some markers, but we should not expect that we will find any stable institutional structure that will cope with these shifting realities in the immediate future. So what I want to name from the conversations that I was hearing here is some of the dissolution of boundaries that are happening because of these shifts in structures. Because again, I think as we begin to think about the shift in structures and the conversations that have to take place, it helps us to also name then how none of the boundaries are holding in quite the same way. And the first one that I found myself hearing was how the traditional boundaries between students and ministry contexts are dissolving. or at least becoming more permeable. Now, I heard this through Jean's presentation about the collaboration of space and place with a ministry context. And I heard this within Mariano's presentation as he talked about new forms of ministry preparation. Past practice had us speaking about a clarity of who were the degree-seeking students, and then who were these folks that we either were going to be in ministry to or possibly serving alongside of while we were taking courses. But there was the ministry context and there were the degree-seeking students. They were separate places, and the seminary sought to be the bridge. Now, whether it was a hopping back and forth bridge or whether it was a bridge that honestly spanned somewhere, I think we've all known seminaries that have done it in various ways. But part of schooling was coming to the seminary to be a part of a liminal space where certain things could be explored that you would not explore directly in your ministry context. So you as a student was you were in a separate type of reality than what you expected your ministry space to be in. You went away to school, and congregations worried about what that meant because they knew that people that went away to school got changed. You went away to school where things and ideas could be explored without permanent consequence. Well, as soon as you mix the ministry location and context with the schooling, you have a dissolved boundary between what can be said where and who's hearing it. And that does become difficult. Not impossible, but it becomes difficult, and you have to find some ways to manage that. I'm reminded of when we had a very strong advancement director at Bethany who was working very hard at getting congregational donors for our ministries. And of course, donors like to be giving to something particular. So she wrote us a note and she said, I'd like to say we will support your course on theology and scripture. We will get a donor who will support your Christology course. We will do this. And I'd like them to be able to then, anytime, come and sit in on your class. Well, from her perspective, it was the way of connecting them. From my perspective, it was the way to shut down any conversation the students could have where they felt like there was a boundary between them and then those that might later call them. Because there were things that needed to be explored that they didn't want to do in front of them. Sometimes because they actually feared they'd say something that would become a threat to a future job. Sometimes it was just needing space to explore. Space for the dangerous conversations that can happen without feeling like you have to come to a resolution that actually when you're a minister of the church you might have to feel a bit more sure about. I actually went into teaching because it felt like I had to be more sure as a minister than I wanted to be. So anyway, so some of the questions that we were directing at Jean, I heard this in. Are the Church of the Resurrection folks here to learn and to be critiqued as well in your settings? They may not be walking into your classroom, but the intersections are dissolving. Are they willing to listen to a critique? Is it going to be a mutually critical setting? What can your students say in what settings as they test things out? Exploration has been very important in our educational structures. What do we do when the ministry contacts overlap? I heard that in our questions of Mariano, because there were times, it was and how is ATS allowing us to do this? Because the clarity of what's degree seeking has been defined. What happens when it is no longer necessarily a student seeking credit for a degree to do ministry, but is ministers in a context learning and understanding what they're doing and not necessarily going after a degree. And in fact, at one point, I think the question was, and what are they seeking in doing this? What are their goals? Part of your listening, what are their goals? Now, what I didn't necessarily hear, but I think we have to recognize is next in this dissolving of boundaries, is there will be an accompanying dissolution of the boundaries surrounding who the teacher is and what training we need to be as teacher. Who, right now, or I should say within a degree-seeking structure, you have a student and a teacher, and the teacher is the one that gives the grade, who makes sure that credit is sufficient, et cetera, et cetera. The teacher within the ministry context became, and here I heard this again in yours a bit, Jean, what do I bring alongside a practitioner? If my students can learn everything about ministry by being with a practitioner, what is my role? And then when is it my role vis-a-vis the student, and when is it my role vis-a-vis the ministry context people? You didn't step into that terrain, but what if you began to want to help them think about how they're doing things? It becomes then a question. So that's one set of traditional boundaries that I think are dissolving. Another set of traditional boundaries that are dissolving are between ecclesial formation and classroom formation. Very interestingly, both the biblical Hebrew scripture presentations here heightened formational and transformational practice within them. Now we can get into later why it was, or maybe we shouldn't get into later, as far as the biblical people that were raising this, but anyway. Education has always had formational and transformational processes, but theological education has frequently depended on a structure of ecclesial formation that brackets its work. You get people who have an undergirding from a particular church. Actually, we haven't been able to say this for 30 years, but we were built on the assumption that we got people who were formed within a church, and then they were heading back out. And we often would say the completion of your ministry training is when you then go back into the church and are there as leader. So it was both its goal and its undergirding. You can still see that some of the strongest residual differences within theological education has to do with this ecclesial formation piece. Roman Catholics have a strong spiritual formation structure, ELCA and your internship structure, PCUSA and your ordination exams, RCA, I've never been able to get my fingers around the classes system, but I know that's your ecclesial piece. When the Church of the Brethren Seminary, Bethany Seminary that I taught at, moved to the Earlham School of Religion campus, which was Quaker, we had a cultural study done to help us think through the pedagogical, ecclesial, and just plain teaching culture issues of what it would mean for us to come alongside them. The most fun thing about that was they said to us, your decision making is going to be really hard because you're both very passive. We kind of said, oh, okay, okay. But we were looking at pedagogy, at size, at culture of teaching and learning, culture of decision making, and they were both very ecclesially shaped. So I would just maintain that part of our institutionality still shows that. But we've long had a sense of those pieces being cared for by people who are actually still maintaining their ecclesial ties, spiritual directors, supervising ministers, CPE supervisors, chaplains, people who run formational classes. We've depended on ecclesial structures for them. When we put formation within the classroom and under the skills of people who have PhDs in disciplines, it becomes a very different question. Worship, liturgy, pastoral care, you've had to deal with this for a number of years, and at least the liturgist that I served alongside of, she was very, very clear to say, we don't worship in my classroom. I teach you about worship and practice. And that was her way of saying, I'm not trying to form you in this. We will be reflecting on it, thinking about it, learning about it, appreciating it, but we're not trying to do it here. Ethics classroom, ethics professors. Actually, the two presentations, Kristen and Kate, and then today, Elias, there are things in which what you did actually took the next step of saying, I know that I'm forming you. So let's think more carefully about what types of conversations you want to have, what types of methods we want to use. But it is a dissolving of what has been a traditional boundary of keeping formation in the church and not in the classroom. And again, I think that's just something we need to think about with some care. Because what does it mean when formation is tied to a particular subject area and not to ecclesial tradition? Those are going to have very differently shaped seminaries. The third boundary is the one that has to do with knowledge and what counts as knowledge. Here we saw this in terms of the ministry experience of the active practitioner, counting as learning and knowledge, both within Jean and Mariano. The incorporation of science modules with Leah, the sociological instincts, insights on our habits and behaviors of exclusion and inclusion, Elias. I loved the careful reflective work that was done around this. I'm going to pick on Leah here just a bit and say a nagging thought, though, always for me was, why didn't they learn this way of thinking about science in their undergraduate? So some of the question is, why here is this necessary? But that can apply to many places and many things that we have to bring in. Why here? My nagging thought actually depends on an assumed structured scaffold path through educational structures, as if everyone did get a BA of a certain sort, as if everyone had a certain basis of knowledge, etc. And I know part of the dissolution of this is that that's no longer dependable. And we know that that path, structured path of knowledge, has never served well a particular group and groups and communities. So what counts as knowledge is being redefined, and therefore what counts as preparation for the training that we want to give is being appropriately challenged. Epistemologies and epistemological structures are opening up, and ways of being educated and prepared are opening up. So all of this is to say that those various dissolutions, the dissolution between the student ministry context and teacher role, dissolution between the ecclesial and educational formation where that is located, what counts as knowledge and what counts as preparation for ministry, all of those do mean that we have a great change in classroom processes. They affect our goals for student learning, and it affects what we mean to have someone prepared for ministry for the 21st century. We've seen here, I think this last 3 days, wonderfully rich educational models and wonderfully rich classroom practices that we've talked about. We've had the questions that are going to arise, I think, still ahead of us. How do we assess how things are learned? Are we actually going to be working with them within some type of grading system? We recognize we are working with adult learners who can already be in ministry and heading towards the settings in which they want to serve. But we also know we're working with adult learners who are heading towards settings of ministry that we have no idea about. I find myself back to that lovely Anselmian phrase, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Right now, we're training for ministry settings for that which we cannot conceive. And that brings another whole realm to the classroom, because you want your students to be prepared and ready, but you really are not able to conceive the type of ministry that they're going to be in the midst of. So when we think about the context of the classroom, when we think of the subject matter and discipline, and we think of the purposes and aims that the teacher brings and that the institution asks for, it becomes a mix of decisions that actually I was wonderfully delighted and surprised to see how well the reflective practices that you all demonstrated were working with those questions. So there's no neat ending, and actually if we had had 15 minutes of time, my question for the table, so this is my ending question for you, would be, I think some of our, well, and I'll pose it this way, I think some of our best work as we move forward is to imagine yourself as a part of theological education learning centers that are not bounded by ATS regulations and not bounded by particular ecclesiologies. What would it look like? And how would you structure it? My sense is those are the types of learning centers that we need to be about encouraging, supporting, whether they're in alternate form alongside a seminary, whether you find yourself a not-for-profit director able to do that, however it could be manifested. I think we're seeing the dropping away of accreditation standards being necessary for ministry preparation. Don't tell Dan. Sorry, Dan. And I think we're seeing ecclesial structures and boundaries dropping away as being what is the most important in terms of ministry training. So I'd love to hear how you would design theological education learning centers. What would be the goals? What would you imagine would be the processes? How would you teach?
Thank you.